Hey everyone, and welcome back to Western Flavors. Before we begin our new episode, let's recap the intense emotional events of our last story. We saw a quiet, rainy day at Heartland turn into a storm of conflict. After Amy confessed to Nathan that she had seen a vision of Ty in the stars, his carefully constructed patience finally shattered. The story ended on a massive cliffhanger, with a hurt and angry Nathan confronting a stunned Amy, demanding to know why she was still haunted by a memory when he was the one who was real and present. If you missed that incredibly dramatic chapter, the link to that is in the description below. If you're enjoying this new season, please take a second to hit that like button and be sure to subscribe so you never miss a chapter. Now today, the fallout from that confrontation triggers a powerful and long-suppressed memory, and we are going to learn the truth about the day Heartland's world fell apart. The silence in the barn was a ringing, deafening thing. Nathan's words, sharp and full of a pain she had never seen in him before, hung in the rain-soaked air between them, an accusation and a plea. Amy stood frozen in the wide doorway, the cold, damp mist clinging to her skin, her mind a complete and utter blank. She stared at the man in front of her, at this stranger with Nathan's face, his eyes now dark with a wounded, jealous anger she didn't recognize. He had always been her safe harbor, her calm in the storm of her own grief. Now he was the storm. His question echoed in her head. What does he have that I don't? The answer was so vast, so profound, so all-encompassing that she had no words for it. How could she possibly explain the history, the shared soul, the 14 years of a love that had defined her entire existence? How could she explain that Ty wasn't just a memory? He was the very bedrock of the woman she had become. She couldn't. Before the silence could stretch to its breaking point, another presence made itself known. A figure appeared from the deep shadows of the main house, walking slowly but with an undeniable, quiet authority across the muddy yard. It was Jack. He held a large, old-fashioned umbrella, a small, practical shield against the relentless downpour. He had clearly seen Nathan's truck, had felt the shift in the atmosphere, and had come to investigate. He had witnessed the entire tense exchange from a distance, had seen the moment Nathan's composure had finally, catastrophically broken. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't rush, he simply walked up to them, his presence a calm, powerful force that immediately de-escalated the volatile situation. He looked from his granddaughter's pale, shocked face to Nathan's, his gaze not one of anger, but of a deep, weary, and empathetic understanding. He saw two good people, both drowning in a situation that was impossible for them to navigate.
Son,
He said, his voice a low, quiet rumble that was almost lost in the sound of the rain. He was speaking to Nathan.
I think Amy needs some space right now.
It was not a command. It was a simple, irrefutable statement of fact, but it carried the undeniable weight of the patriarch of Heartland, a quiet, firm request that Nathan could not refuse. The anger in Nathan's face seemed to drain away, replaced by a wave of shame and immediate, profound regret. He looked at Amy, at the hurt and confusion in her eyes, and the reality of what he had just done, the pressure he had just put on this woman he cared for so deeply, crashed down on him.
Amy, I'm sorry. I shouldn't have.
It's okay.
She whispered, though it wasn't. It wasn't okay at all.
No, it's not. Jack's right. I should go.
He gave her one last long look, his eyes full of a miserable, unspoken apology, and then he turned and walked back to his truck, his shoulders slumped in defeat. Amy watched him go, her mind too numb to process the whiplash of the last 10 minutes. He got in his truck and drove away, the red of his taillights a bleeding wound in the gray, misty afternoon. The moment he was gone, the strength that had been holding Amy together seemed to evaporate. A great shuddering sob escaped her, and her legs felt weak beneath her. Jack was there instantly, his strong, familiar arm wrapping around her shoulders, holding her up.
Come on, let's get you inside, out of this rain.
He guided his granddaughter, who felt as fragile as a child in that moment, back towards the warm, safe lights of the house. He led her into the quiet of the living room and settled her into the deep, comfortable armchair by the cold fireplace. He disappeared for a moment and returned with a thick plaid blanket, which he gently draped over her shoulders. He then built a fire, his movements slow and methodical, the familiar ritual a comforting domestic anchor in the storm of her emotions. Amy just sat there, staring blankly into the flames as they began to lick at the dry wood. The confrontation with Nathan, his raw, angry words, had been a violent, emotional trigger. It had ripped the scab off a wound she thought had begun to heal, and now the past was bleeding into the present with a terrifying, unstoppable force. The trauma of the argument, the feeling of being torn between two worlds, it all began to blur, to merge with a much older, much deeper trauma. The crackle of the fire began to sound like the sterile, rhythmic beeping of a hospital monitor. The scent of wood smoke was replaced by the sharp, antiseptic smell of a waiting room. The comforting warmth of the living room dissolved, replaced by the cold, impersonal chill of a place where life and death hung in the balance. The last 4 years of her life began to peel away, and she was suddenly, terrifyingly right back at the beginning. She was back on the worst day of her life. The crackling fire in the Heartland living room was a warm, living thing, but Amy felt none of it. She was shivering, a deep, bone-deep chill that had nothing to do with the rain outside. The comforting, familiar room around her was dissolving, its soft edges blurring, the cozy details replaced by a stark, clinical whiteness that was seared into her memory. The gentle pop and hiss of the burning logs was fading, replaced by the relentless, rhythmic beeping of a machine, the frantic squeak of rubber-soled shoes on a linoleum floor, and the echo of her own voice, a raw, desperate scream that seemed to belong to someone else entirely. The past was no longer a memory. It was a place, and she was falling back into it. 4 years earlier, the day had started with a perfect cloudless sky, the kind of late autumn Alberta morning that felt like a gift. The air was crisp and cool, and the sun was a brilliant, warm gold on the changing leaves of the aspen trees. It was a day of profound, simple peace. Ty had been in the paddock, working with a young, nervous colt, his movements a familiar, graceful dance of patience and strength. Amy had been watching from the fence line, a happy 4-year-old Lindy perched on her hip, her small hands clapping with delight every time the colt would finally trustingly touch its muzzle to her father's hand. It was a perfect, ordinary moment, the kind of moment that builds a life, and then, in a single, terrifying instant, it had shattered. Ty had suddenly stopped. He'd swayed on his feet, a look of strange, pained confusion on his face. He had brought a hand to his chest, his breath coming in a short, sharp gasp.
Ty, what is it? Are you okay?
Her voice had been full of a sudden, sharp alarm. He had tried to answer, had tried to form a reassuring smile, but the words wouldn't come. His eyes, which had been so full of life and love just a second before, went wide with a terrifying, unseeing shock. And then he had collapsed, a puppet whose strings had been suddenly violently cut, his body hitting the soft dirt of the paddock with a heavy, final thud. The world had devolved into a nightmare of fragmented, chaotic moments. Amy's own scream, a raw, animal sound of pure terror. Lindy, sensing the horror of the moment, bursting into tears. Amy frantically trying to find a pulse, her own hands shaking so badly she couldn't feel anything. Jack, his face a mask of grim, ashen-white focus, on the phone, his voice a low, urgent command to the 911 operator. The wail of the approaching ambulance, a sound that would be seared into her memory forever, a soundtrack to the end of her world. The scene shifted, the blurry, frantic chaos of the ranch replaced by the stark, sterile, and terrifyingly calm atmosphere of the Rocky Mountain General Hospital. The waiting room was a small, airless box of white walls, uncomfortable plastic chairs, and a profound, timeless silence. It was a place where life was suspended, where every tick of the clock on the wall was a small, deliberate act of torture. Amy sat on one of the plastic chairs, her body numb, her mind a complete and utter blank. Jack stood by the window, a stoic, unmoving statue, staring out at a parking lot he didn't see. Lou paced the small room like a caged animal, her phone clutched in her hand, her face a mask of frantic, desperate energy. And Lindy, her small body curled up on the chair beside her mother, had finally cried herself to sleep, her face blotchy and tear-stained, her small hand still clutching the toy horse Ty had carved for her. They were a family in limbo, trapped between a perfect morning and a future that was too terrifying to contemplate. Every time the double doors at the end of the hallway swung open, their heads would snap up in a unified, desperate hope, only to fall again as a nurse or a doctor walked by without a glance in their direction. Then, the doors swung open again, and this time it was for them. Lily and Wade rushed in, their faces a mess of raw, panicked fear. Lily's eyes, wide and searching, immediately found Amy's. What happened? They wouldn't tell us anything on the phone. Is he okay? Where is he? Her voice was a high, thin, and desperate wail. Amy couldn't answer. She couldn't form the words. She just shook her head, a small, helpless gesture that seemed to suck all the air out of the room. Wade, his own face pale and grim, put a steadying arm around his wife's shoulders, his own terror overshadowed by his need to be her rock. They joined the silent, terrible vigil. The minutes stretched into an hour, then two. The silence in the waiting room was a living, breathing thing, a monster that fed on their fear and their hope. Finally, the double doors at the end of the hall swung open again. A doctor, his face tired and impossibly grave, walked towards them, a chart held in his hand like a verdict. The family rose as one, a small, terrified huddle. "Are you the family of Ty Borden?" Jack was the one who answered, his voice a low, rough croak.
We are. I'm his grandfather-in-law. This is his wife, Amy, his mother, Lily.
The doctor's eyes, full of a deep professional pity, met Amy's for a fleeting second before moving on. He took a deep, weary breath, the sound impossibly loud in the silent room. "I'm so sorry. We did everything we could." The words, so simple, so clinical, so utterly final, didn't seem to register at first. They were a language from another planet. Amy just stared at him, her mind refusing to connect the sounds with their meaning. Mr. Borden suffered a massive pulmonary embolism, a blood clot. A complication from his previous injury traveled to his lungs. It was instantaneous. There was nothing anyone could have done. He was gone before he even hit the ground. "I'm so sorry for your loss." Loss. Gone. The words began to filter through the thick fog of her shock, and then the world shattered. Amy's vision went black at the edges. The doctor's face, the white walls, the horrified expressions of her family, it all began to swim and recede, as if she were looking at them from the bottom of a deep, dark well. She felt the strength leave her body, her legs giving way beneath her as the world dissolved into a roaring, black nothingness. She was fainting, a small, final mercy from a pain too vast for her conscious mind to bear. Her collapse was the catalyst that broke the spell of stunned disbelief for the others. Lindy, who had woken up at the sound of the doctor's voice, saw her mother fall, and then her gaze shifted to the hospital room door, the one they wouldn't let her go into, and she understood. Her daddy was in there, and he was gone forever. A gut-wrenching, child's wail of pure, unadulterated heartbreak erupted from her small body. And Lily just froze. She stood perfectly still, her eyes wide and unseeing, her face a mask of complete and utter catatonia. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just broke. The light in her eyes went out, her soul retreating to a place where the pain couldn't reach her. Then, after a long, terrible moment of absolute silence, a single low, animalistic moan began to emanate from deep within her chest, a sound of such profound, primal grief that it was more terrifying than any scream could ever be. She began to crumble, to sink to the floor, the sound growing into a gut-wrenching, continuous wail as Wade and a suddenly mobilized Jack and Lou rushed to catch her, to hold the pieces of her shattered world together. The Heartland family, the strong, resilient, and unbreakable core of their world, had been utterly and completely destroyed in the space of a single terrible moment in a cold, white, and unforgiving hospital waiting room. The day after Ty's death was a landscape of profound and surreal emptiness. The world, which had been a vibrant, colorful place just 2 days before, had been rendered in muted shades of gray. At Heartland, a heavy, suffocating silence had fallen, the kind of quiet that is not peaceful, but is the sound of a gaping, unfillable void. The family moved through the house like ghosts, their movements slow and disconnected, each of them lost in their own private, silent sea of grief. They were a constellation of mourning souls, orbiting a center that had suddenly, catastrophically, vanished. In the midst of their shared, catatonic shock, the terrible, practical questions of death began to intrude. There were arrangements to be made, decisions that felt both impossible and insultingly mundane. It was Lou, her own grief a tightly controlled, almost manic energy, who took charge. She became the family's reluctant navigator, making the necessary, soul-crushing phone calls, her voice a brittle, professional shield against the tide of her own sorrow. The most difficult decision was the final one. What to do with him? Amy, still in a state of profound, numb shock, remembered a conversation she and Ty had had years ago, a quiet, late-night talk about a friend who had passed away.
"I don't want to be buried," Ty had said, his voice a low, thoughtful murmur in the darkness of their bedroom. "I don't want to be trapped in a box under the ground. I want to be a part of the land, the wind, the mountains, just spread my ashes somewhere beautiful, somewhere free.
The memory, so distant and yet so clear, was his final wish, a last, ghostly instruction. And so, the decision was made. They would have him cremated. The crematorium was a place on the outskirts of Calgary, a modern, soulless building of concrete and smoked glass that felt profoundly disconnected from the natural, beautiful life Ty had lived. They had chosen it from a list provided by the hospital, a blind, desperate choice made in a fog of grief. They arrived in a small, somber procession, the family packed into 2 cars, a broken, silent fleet, navigating a city that seemed oblivious to the fact that their world had just ended. The air inside the building was cold and smelled faintly of artificial flowers and disinfectant. The director, a man with a practiced, somber expression and a suit that was a size too tight, met them in the lobby. He spoke in a low, hushed tone, his words of condolence a smooth, well-rehearsed script that offered no real comfort. "We are so sorry for your loss. We want to assure you that we will take the utmost care of Mr. Borden. He is in good hands." His words felt hollow, a corporate slogan for the business of death. Amy, clinging to Jack's arm, felt a strange, immediate sense of unease. There was something about the place, something about the man's polished, impersonal demeanor that felt wrong. They were ushered into a small, tastefully decorated waiting room, a place of muted carpets and generic landscape paintings. The director explained the process, his voice a droning, monotonous sound that seemed to suck the very air out of the room. He spoke of paperwork, of timelines, of the different types of urns available. It was a business transaction, and it was a desecration. Amy, her own voice, a fragile, trembling thread, finally spoke the one thing her heart needed.
Can we see him? One last time? Before...
She couldn't finish the sentence. The director's smooth, sympathetic expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "I'm afraid that won't be possible. Due to the sudden nature of Mr. Borden's passing and the subsequent autopsy, there are strict sanitary protocols we must adhere to. It's for the best. It's better to remember him as he was." The excuse was plausible, clinical, and delivered with a practiced finality that was designed to shut down any further questions. But it felt wrong. A cold, sharp alarm bell began to ring in the back of Amy's mind, a flicker of something that was not grief, but suspicion. Why? What possible reason could there be?
That's a load of crap.
Tim's voice was a low, angry growl. He had been a silent, simmering volcano of grief since he had arrived, but now his protective, paternal instincts were flaring.
We are his family. We have a right to see him.
"I understand your distress, sir, but our facility has regulations. We are bound by provincial health and safety standards. It is simply not our policy." His tone was polite, but it was as unyielding as a brick wall. Jack, seeing the uselessness of the argument, placed a restraining hand on Tim's arm. An ugly public scene was the last thing any of them needed. They were defeated. They were forced to retreat back into the small, quiet waiting room while the necessary, unseen things were done. The feeling of wrongness, however, only intensified. The process was unnervingly, almost suspiciously, fast. There was no sense of ceremony, no reverence. It was a cold, efficient, and impersonal procedure. A short time later, a different employee, a young man who wouldn't quite meet their eyes, entered the room. He was carrying a heavy, polished wooden box. He simply handed it to Amy, murmured another quiet, "I'm sorry for your loss," and then left them alone. Amy took the box. It was surprisingly heavy, solid, and real in her hands. She ran her fingers over the smooth, cool wood. This was it. This was all that was left of him. The strong, vibrant, living man she had loved, the father of her child, the other half of her soul, was now reduced to a container of dust and bone fragments. The finality of it, the sheer, brutal, and impersonal nature of it, was a fresh wave of agony. She let out a small, choked sob and would have collapsed if Jack hadn't been there to hold her up. Present day, the memory, so vivid and so painful, finally released its grip. Amy shuddered, a full-body tremor, and came crashing back to the present. She was in the Heartland living room, a warm blanket around her, the fire crackling in the hearth. The cold, sterile air of the crematorium was gone, replaced by the familiar, comforting scent of her own home. But the feeling of that day, the deep, unsettling feeling of wrongness, lingered. She had buried it, of course. In the chaotic, all-consuming tsunami of her grief, that small, strange detail, the refusal, the rushed process, the shifty-eyed employee, had been a tiny, insignificant piece of driftwood. Her husband was gone. That was the only fact that had mattered. The rest was just the unpleasant, bureaucratic machinery of death. But now, pulled from the depths of her memory by the trauma of the day's events, it felt different. It felt significant. For a fleeting, terrifying moment, a wild, insane thought, a thought so illogical it was barely a whisper, entered her mind. What if it wasn't him in that box? She pushed the thought away with a violent internal shove. It was a crazy thought, the desperate, nonsensical bargaining of a grieving mind. It was a product of her own recent, strange visions, of her own emotional turmoil. Of course it was him. He was gone. She had held his ashes. She had spread them on the ridge where they had planned to build their home. He was a part of the land now, a part of the wind. She had to let it go. It was just a memory, twisted by grief and time. She took a deep, steadying breath, forcing the unsettling feeling down, burying it once again under the heavy, familiar weight of her loss. She had to be strong. She had to be present. Her family was waiting. She dried her eyes, stood up, and with a final, shaky breath, she walked towards the warm, bright light of the kitchen, ready to face the evening, the ghost of a new and very old question now silently trailing behind her. Amy walked into the kitchen, the ghost of her terrible memory clinging to her like a shroud. The room was a beacon of warmth and light, a stark, welcome contrast to the cold, sterile hallways of her own mind. The rich, savory scent of Lisa's beef stew filled the air, a familiar, comforting aroma that was the very essence of a Heartland family dinner. Lisa was at the stove, stirring the large pot, her expression one of quiet, focused care. Lou was setting the table, her movements efficient and deliberate, creating order out of the day's emotional chaos. And Jack, her grandfather, looked up as she entered, his eyes full of a deep, unspoken understanding. He had seen her sitting by the fire, lost in a world of her own, and he had known not to push. He just gave her a small, supportive nod, a silent question, "Are you all right?" She gave him a weak, watery smile in return. A silent answer, "I will be." She busied herself with a small, unnecessary task, pouring water into glasses, her hands needing the simple, grounding act of doing something normal. The memory of the crematorium, of the unsettling feeling of wrongness, was a persistent, low-grade hum in the back of her mind. She tried to push it away, to label it as a symptom of her own trauma, a story her grieving mind had created to make sense of the senseless, but it was a stubborn thought, and it refused to be completely silenced. Dinner was a quiet affair. The family gathered around the big wooden table, the storm outside still lashing against the windows, a dramatic, percussive soundtrack to their somber mood. The argument between Amy and Nathan had cast a long shadow over the evening, and an unspoken tension still lingered in the air. The conversation was stilted, full of polite, meaningless chatter about the weather, about the price of feed, about anything and everything except the one thing that was on everyone's mind. Lindy, who had been unusually quiet throughout the meal, had been watching her mother with a child's intense, perceptive gaze. She saw the redness in Amy's eyes, the forced brightness of her smile, the way she was pushing the food around on her plate more than she was eating it. Finally, her innocent curiosity could be contained no longer. She looked at her mother, her own small face a mask of loving concern. "Mommy, why are you so sad?" The question, so simple and so direct, cut through the polite, adult chatter and landed in the center of the table with the force of a physical blow. All conversation stopped. All eyes turned to Amy. She looked at her daughter, at her beautiful, innocent, and deeply empathetic face, and she felt a fresh wave of tears threaten. But she would not cry, not in front of her. She took a deep, steadying breath and gave her daughter a real, honest, though deeply sad, smile.
"I'm okay, sweetie. I was thinking about your daddy today."
The name, Ty's name, was spoken, and the atmosphere in the room shifted. It was no longer a tense, awkward silence. It was a shared, sorrowful one. Lindy's own expression softened with a sad, mature understanding that was far beyond her 9 years. In the 4 years since her father's death, she had learned to live with his memory. It was no longer a source of acute, terrifying pain for her. It was a quiet, constant presence, a story of a hero she had been lucky enough to call her dad. "Oh, I miss him too," she said, her voice a small, quiet murmur. The simple, honest exchange had broken the dam of their unspoken grief. The elephant was no longer in the room. He was sitting at the head of the table. It was Jack who, as always, knew the way forward. He looked around the table at the sad, beloved faces of his family, at the empty chair that would always, in some way, belong to Ty. He knew they could not let this somber mood define their evening, their life. They had to find a way to honor the memory of the man they had lost, not with a sorrowful silence, but with the joy and the love he had brought into their lives. He cleared his throat, his voice a quiet, powerful rumble that drew everyone's attention.
Before we finish up, I was thinking, we haven't said a proper grace tonight, and I think tonight should be a special one.
He looked at each of them in turn, his gaze settling for a moment on Amy's tear-filled eyes.
Instead of our usual words, I was thinking that tonight, for grace, we should each share one memory, one good, happy memory of Ty, not a sad one, a memory that makes us smile, as a way of thanking him for the light he brought into all of our lives, as a way of keeping that light burning right here at this table.
The suggestion was a gift, a beautiful, simple, and profoundly healing idea. A slow, watery smile broke across Lisa's face. Lou nodded, a single, grateful tear tracing a path down her cheek. And Amy looked at her grandfather, her heart so full of love and gratitude for his quiet, constant wisdom that she felt it might break all over again, but this time in a good way. Jack began. He spoke of the first day Ty had arrived, a surly, angry kid in the back of a social worker's car. He told the story of Ty's first clumsy attempt to muck out a stall, a story he had told 100 times, but tonight it was infused with a new, profound tenderness.
He had this fire in him, a wild, untamed thing, but I looked at him, and I didn't see a troublemaker. I saw a survivor, and I knew, right then and there, that this was where he belonged, that he was one of our own.
Lisa went next. She spoke of the night before Ty and Amy's wedding, of finding Ty on the porch, so full of a nervous, beautiful, and utterly terrified love that it had taken her own breath away. Lou, with a small, tearful laugh, told a story about Ty's brief, disastrous, and hilarious career as a bartender at Maggie's. Tim, his own voice thick with an emotion he rarely showed, spoke of the quiet, profound respect he had felt for Ty, the man who had loved his daughter with a fierceness that had healed his own fatherly heart. Finally, it was Amy's turn. She looked around the table at the faces of her family, now soft and smiling through their tears. The heavy, somber mood had been lifted, replaced by a warm, glowing tapestry of shared, happy memories. She thought for a moment, and then she knew exactly which memory to share.
I remember the first time I ever really saw him. Not the angry kid from juvie, but him. We were in the barn, and a pregnant mare was in distress, and I saw him with her. The way he spoke to her, the gentleness in his hands, he had this gift, this profound, quiet understanding. And I remember thinking, in that one single moment, oh, there you are. It was like I had been waiting for him my whole life, and I just didn't know it until he was right there in front of me.
She finished, her voice a quiet, steady murmur. The story of Ty, the man they had loved and lost, was not a tragedy. It was a beautiful, powerful, and enduring love story, and it was their story. The grace was complete. And in the warm, gentle quiet of the Heartland kitchen, surrounded by the love of her family, Amy finally felt the last of the day's storm begin to pass, leaving a quiet, healing peace in its wake. The quiet, healing warmth of the family dinner at Heartland was a world away from the scene that was simultaneously unfolding hundreds of miles to the south, under the vast, star-dusted sky of Montana. Here the landscape was different, drier, dustier, a rugged, sprawling expanse of sagebrush and rock under the shadow of a different set of mountains. The air was thick with the scent of wood smoke, roasted coffee, and the musky, earthy smell of a large herd of cattle settling down for the night. A group of cowboys were gathered around a crackling campfire, their faces weathered and sun-creased, their bodies weary from a long day on a cattle drive. Their talk was a low, easy rumble of familiar topics: the price of beef, a difficult horse, the promise of a cold beer when they finally got back to town. Among them, slightly separate from the main group, sat a man known only as Benjamin. He had been with the ranch for almost 2 years, and in that time he had earned a quiet, solid reputation. He was the hardest worker any of them had ever seen, his stamina seemingly limitless. He was preternaturally gifted with the animals, his hands both gentle and incredibly sure, able to calm a spooked horse or treat an injured calf with an instinct that bordered on magical. But he was a man shrouded in mystery. He rarely spoke of his past, and when he did, it was in vague, evasive terms. His eyes, though kind, held a deep, profound, and seemingly permanent sadness, the look of a man who had lost something so fundamental he couldn't even remember what it was. He was a capable, respected man, but he was a man without a history, a ghost who had simply appeared on their doorstep one day looking for work. He sat now, nursing a tin mug of coffee, staring into the dancing flames of the fire, his mind a quiet, familiar blank. He was listening to the easy banter of the other ranch hands, a participant in a life that felt both real and strangely disconnected, as if he were an actor playing a part he hadn't fully memorized. One of the younger cowboys, a talkative kid named Rusty, was telling a story he'd heard from a friend who worked a ranch up near the Canadian border. So he swears it's true. This outfit up in Alberta, they had this wild, untamable stallion. Thing had thrown every rider who got near it. They were about to give up on him, and they call in this woman. Another, older cowboy, a grizzled man named Hank, let out a skeptical snort. "Here we go again. One of your tall tales, Rusty?" "No, I swear." And she walks into the pen with him. No ropes, no nothing. And in an hour, she's riding him around the pen, calm as a sleeping dog. My buddy said it was like watching magic. Said they call her a horse whisperer. The story, a familiar piece of ranch hand lore, drew a few interested murmurs from the group. Benjamin, however, continued to stare into the fire, the story a distant, meaningless noise. "I've heard of her. The one up at that place, Heartland. My cousin sold a mare to her a few years back. Said she was the real deal. What was her name again? Amy. Amy Fleming." The name, spoken casually into the cool night air, was a stone dropped into the quiet, still pool of Benjamin's mind. He looked up from the fire, his entire body going rigid. The name echoed in the vast, empty corridors of his memory, a sound that was both completely foreign and achingly, impossibly familiar. A flicker of something, a ghost of a memory, a half-formed image of a woman with blonde hair and a brilliant smile flashed behind his eyes and was gone before he could catch it. He interrupted, his own voice a low, rough murmur that was so unexpected, it made the other cowboys turn to look at him.
Amy Fleming?
Rusty, surprised by the quiet man's interest, eagerly leaned forward. "Yeah, that's her. You heard of her? They say she can gentle any horse, that it's a gift passed down from her mother. Runs a big ranch up there in the foothills with her family. Does a lot of work with, what they call it, natural horsemanship. The details: Alberta, the foothills, a gift for healing horses passed down from a mother, were a series of small, sharp needles, each one pricking at the thick, protective scar tissue around his lost memories. He felt a strange, powerful, and deeply unsettling pull, a sense of recognition so profound it was a physical ache in his chest. He stood up, the movement abrupt, and walked away from the fire, away from the confused stares of the other men. He stood in the deep darkness at the edge of the camp, staring north, in the direction of a country he didn't know, a life he couldn't remember. He whispered the name to himself, testing the shape of it on his tongue. It felt right. It felt like a key to a door he hadn't even known was locked. His mind was a blank, a vast, empty prairie. But for the first time, in the far, far distance, he could see a single, solitary light. The final shot of the episode is a tight close-up on his face, his eyes full of a deep, profound confusion and a flicker of a memory he can't possibly place, as he whispers the name to himself one last time, a question, a mystery, and the first, terrifying step on a long, impossible journey back home.